Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 235. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about my latest article at the Libertarian Institute titled Dave Smith Fractures the Mainstream Narrative on Yemen. The article's been very well received, so I'm really excited for to talk about this because there's been so much action, so many people sharing and telling me they like the article. So I think this will be a great show. Share it. You find it at the Libertarian Institute along with the rest of my work. We also post the show on the blog at antiwar.com, and most of what I write could be found there as well. You can support this show by donating at Patreon, Subscribestar, or in crypto, or by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. When you spend $75 or more and use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, you save 20% off and the show gets a kickback. They have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde, and it's expanding lineup, so if you haven't been to the site in a while, go check it out, see what they got. I know a lot of people like CBD, so do your shopping at Paloma Verde. You get a great price, high quality CBD products, and you help out your favorite show. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into it. Now, I was prompted to write this article because after Dave Smith went on the Joe Rogan Experience and did such a fantastic job talking about Yemen, there was a short discussion of it on the Tim Pool podcast with the guest on the show, Cory Mills, who's running for Congress and, has one of these, well, I'm a tough conservative, but I'm also non-interventionist attitudes. And he put out there that, look, Dave Smith is misrepresenting what's happening in Yemen. It's more a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so that's what I really address in my article. I write, next month, the war in Yemen will turn 7. At a minimum, the war has killed 400,000 people. For several years, many notable aid groups have considered Yemen to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Over half the population relies on food and medical aid, now being scaled back due to a lack of funding. Millions of Yemeni children are malnourished. Many are dying from starvation. The destruction of the war will plague Yemen for decades to come. The primary cause of Yemen's suffering is the Saudi-led coalition's multi-domain war on Yemen. Yet, calling the coalition Saudi-led obscures the essential roles that the US, UK, and UAE play in waging the war. The war effort is primarily led by Saudi Arabia's Air Force, which is dependent on the US and UK. If one were to peel off the Saudi warplane insignias, it would reveal their American and British origins. The US and UK continue to maintain Saudi air fleet, which would be grounded if the support was withheld. And so just to get into this a little bit more here, when we're talking about, maintaining the planes, so almost the entire Saudi air fleet is either UK or US made fighter jets, right? Like F-15s, 16s, things like this. Tornadoes, I think our Typhoons are the UK fighter planes that they use. And so, you can't fly those things 1,000 times without doing like routine maintenance, even if nobody's shooting at the planes and the pilots are all doing their job perfectly, replacing the tires and the brakes and, I'm sure far more complicated things than I understand or, explain requires very frequent and expensive maintenance of these planes that are provided by U.S. defense contractors. And so withholding those contracts, which the government can do because it is a weapons sale essentially, would be something that could be done by the US and UK and very quickly end the conflict going on here. But that is not what's happening. And in fact, the US and UK continue to do that, even though Biden said February, not of 2022, but of 2021, right after taking office, that we are going to end Saudi support for Saudi's offensive. He did use the word offensive, which at the time on this show we said was just a loophole that he could drive an entire war through and has. But this support is very important. And then, of course, continuing to sell Saudi Arabia missiles, and the UK has continued to sell Saudi Arabia bombs. So all of this is very important. Getting back to the article, The Saudis' bombing campaign frequently hits civilian targets. Recently, Riyadh bombed a communications building and knocked out the northern Yemen internet for several days. That strike also killed children playing soccer. Shortly after, Saudi Arabia used an American-made bomb to kill 91 people at a migrant detention facility. The recent war crimes are a part of a more extensive campaign directed at Yemen's civilian population. In a report for the World Peace Foundation, Martha Mundi describes the food war waged by Saudi Arabia. If one places the damage to the resources of the food producers alongside the targeting of food processing, storage, transportation, urban areas, and the economic war, there is strong evidence that the coalition's strategy was aimed to destroy food production and distribution in areas under control of Sana'a, or that would be the Houthis, as described above from the autumn 2016 economic war has compounded physical destruction to create mass failure in basic livelihoods. And so that was from Martha Mundi's report. Continuing my article, American officials have assisted the Saudis bombing with intelligence and target selection. Some U.S. officials even worry this level of involvement will expose them to potential war crimes. Despite its horrific effects on the civilian population, Riyadh's bombing campaign has proven ineffective against Houthi military operations. From June to November, Houthi sources say Saudi strikes killed 15,000 fighters. Still, the casualties did not prevent the group from making substantial gains in the Mareb and Shabwa provinces. Another prong of the coalition's war effort is backing Proxy ground forces in Yemen. And this is, by the way, the Saudi side of the war. Iran, would never be referred to as the coalition. Yemeni journalist Nasser Arabi report that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are backing al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Further investigation by CNN revealed jihadists were using U.S.-made weapons that were originally sold to the Saudis and Emirates. Recent losses by the Houthi in the Shabwa and Marib provinces came because Salafist militias backed by the UAE, the Giants Brigade, was deployed to the region. The militia quickly reversed Houthi gains that cost months and thousands of lives. And so, this is something that I had talked about in the past on the show, this advance by the Giants Brigade in the Shabwa and then the Marib provinces, and how this was a militia that was backed by the UAE, but also supportive of the Hadi government, and that is the Saudi side of this war as well. And that even before it happened, the recent missile launches by the Houthi against the UAE, I was talking about on this show how it would be a potential retaliation move by the Houthis to lash out and fire missiles at the countries backing the militant groups that are pushing into their territory and things like that. So back to the article here. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia have also weaponized the UN against Yemen. The U.S. pushed the UN to pass Resolution 2216, which Saudi Arabia has used as a legal pretext for its actions in Yemen. In 2021, using blackmail and bribes, Saudi Arabia pushed the UN Human Rights Council to remove its investigators from Yemen. Since the vote, the Saudis have significantly escalated the air war. January 2022 was the deadliest months for civilians since 2016. Despite the Saudi air campaign's brutality and ground fighting, the Saudi economic front is the most deadly. Riyadh enforces strict inspection requirements for ships attempting to bring cargo to Yemeni ports. These requirements amount to a de facto blockade. Aid groups report that desperately needed medical supplies, potable water, and food often wait off the coast while people die of preventable causes. The U.S. helps Saudi Arabia enforce these inspections. Additionally, Biden is currently considering redesignating the Houthis, adding them to the foreign terrorist organizations list. The move will have little impact on Houthi leadership, who are already subject to U.S. sanctions, but aid groups warn the move will have devastating impacts on civilians. The caustic FTO label was slapped on the Houthis in the final days of the Trump administration, literally like the last 3 days of the administration. But after some deliberation, the Biden White House was removed the designation because of its unproductive cruelty. To further Yemen's economic woes, Saudi Arabia has flooded the Yemeni market with newly printed Yemeni rials. To combat rising inflation, the Houthis stopped allowing recently dated notes to circulate as currency. Riyadh responded by finding some older dated notes to pump into Yemen. Despite Washington's escalating role, it has gone nearly uncovered by the U.S. media. Adam Johnson reported on his Substack, The Column, a recent review of MSNBC coverage from November 3rd, 2020 to November 22nd, 2021 shows MSNBC hasn't run a single segment on the U.S.-backed war still raging in Yemen. This is why Dave Smith's recent 10-minute discussion of Yemen on the Joe Rogan Experience was so important. For the first time, tens of millions of Americans were exposed to the story of Yemen. More crucially, Smith presented the story without the typical pro-empire spin, with nearly all Western coverage masking America's leading role and framing the conflict as a Saudi-Iran proxy war. However, Smith was attacked on this issue by TimCast guest Cory Mills, who argued that it was Smith who failed to provide proper context. Mills launched his argument that the Houthis are an Iranian puppet force by saying, "You are failing to understand what the Proxy militia force is from Iran," and there he's talking about the Houthi. And so that claim is simply incorrect. The Houthis are primarily Zaidi Shia, a native population of Yemen. The group existed long before and fought several different battles with the government, the previous government of Yemen, led by Ali Abdullah Saleh. And so, this isn't like some uniquely Iranian bad proxy force to take on the Houthis. And in fact, in late 2014, the U.S. worked with the Houthis to target their common enemy, AQAP. Now, about 80% of Yemen's population lives in Houthi-controlled area. Mills goes on to claim that Iran was caught shipping mid-range ballistic missiles to Yemen, and a UN report confirmed his claims. He also said the Houthis had carried out strikes that shut down the Saudi oil company Aramco and targeted the UAE. The Houthis do claim responsibility for a September 2019 attack on a Saudi Aramco facility that for several days caused production to substantially drop, though Saudi Arabia and the U.S. led a group of states claiming Iran was behind the attacks. The UN has said it is unable to independently corroborate the cruise missile and unmanned aerial vehicles used in these attacks are of Iranian origin. The Houthi also claim responsibility for the most recent attacks on the UAE, while an Iraqi militia claimed to be responsible for one attack. No evidence has emerged Iran played a role in those attacks on the UAE. The Houthis' drone attacks are a predictable consequence of the UAE's support for the Giants Brigade and AQAP. Now, I just want to note here that in the past on the show, me and Connor Freeman, who's the co-host of the show, had talked about that when these recent attacks on the UAE happened, we thought it was actually notable that the UAE was only blaming the Houthi and not pointing the finger whatsoever at Iran. A 2015 UN report from a Security Council expert panel found Iran had been assisting the Houthi from 2019 until that point. However, Gareth Porter debunks the report's central claims, explaining that Yemenis were smuggling weapons out of Yemen. And so there were 2 or 3 examples that they were able to pull in that report. And, Gareth goes through and debunks them all in this article. I linked to it in my piece. But just very quickly, I think in 2 of those cases, the ships were found to have weapons. but those weapons were leaving Yemen for Somalia. And part of the reason for this is that Yemen is one of the most armed countries in the world, and so that they really don't need to send small arms to Yemen, because actually, like, second or third on the list behind the U.S. and maybe Iraq is where Yemen comes in, and how well the civilian population is armed. So yeah, so the weapons weren't going to Yemen, they were leaving Yemen. And then there was another ship that was intercepted, and they claimed it was an Iranian smuggling ship going to Yemen, but they failed to find any weapons on that ship, so that's another major problem. Then more, I want to address more of the claims here. Not that Mills doesn't like bring up any examples actually when he says it, he just says, UN reports back his claims. So in my effort to steelman his arguments, I did go and do a pretty thorough search and find all the most because people made statements all the time that the Iran are backing the Houthi, but I did try to find the ones where the claims were made, it had maybe the most substantial parts to them, or did involve the UN. And so the three examples I was pulling up there were the 2019 Aramco attack, where the UN says it didn't happen, the 2015 expert panel, which Gareth Porter confirms, and then getting back to the article here, in 2017, Nikki Haley, then Washington ambassador to the UN, stood in front of scrap metal and claimed to have proof that Iran was providing Houthis with missiles. Not even the New York Times bought the flimsy evidence, reporting the Trump administration tried to mount a case on Thursday that Iran violated an international agreement to limit its arms dealings, but American officials failed to show how a range of weaponry presented as evidence proved those charges. The Houthi and Iran have political ties. This should be seen as a normal relationship. While it's common for the Houthis to be called rebels or terrorists, for over 7 years, the group has ruled Sana'a, Yemen's capital city. In fact, a recent trend in Yemen is for people to leave Saudi-held territory. For the Houthi-held areas, increased security and stability. So some ties between Tehran and Sana'a should be expected. Further, as the Houthis are governing Yemen, it's logical that they would seek to strike against Saudi Arabia or the UAE, since those states are waging an aggressive, unprovoked war against Yemen. And even if Tehran were selling weapons to Yemen, compared to the American weapons cause suffering, the consequences and the suffering caused by the Iranian weapons would be absolutely consequential. All the reports from the aid groups, absolutely all the reports from any groups on this conflict absolutely show it's primarily the Saudi blockade and the Saudi air war that's causing the majority of the problems for the people in Yemen. So I wrap up here with saying, for Mills to claim that Smith was leaving out context, a claim that host Tim Pool seemed to back at the end of the discussion, is laughable. However, Mills' claim is unsurprising. There is a growing trend of Republicans who claim the title of non-interventionist while proudly repeating the war states' talking points. And that's exactly what Mills does here. He doesn't necessarily say that America needs to remain really involved in Yemen, and he kind of stumbles through that part and says, I'm a non-interventionist. But at the end of the day, when you're reporting and confirming the war states' narrative, you're doing their work for them, and you're taking America in that direction. And so anyways, again, one thing I really do want to take another second to highlight is Dave's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience is so important. Anytime you read an article, anytime there's a news segment on Yemen, it's very rare that I hear where it's not almost framed within the first 30 seconds, the first 3 paragraphs. This is a conflict between Saudi Arabia and the Iranian-backed Houthis, the Iranian Proxy group Houthis, and all this. And what that does is it tells everybody it's okay to support this war because this war is about combating Iran. And that's just absolutely not the case. It hasn't been from the start. As Dave points out in that article, the Obama administration told the Washington Post that this was about placating the Saudis because they were concerned that when America was signing the Iran nuclear deal, it would pivot America towards the Iranian side in the Middle East. I guess, Iran is a less brutal government than the Saudis. And so if you want to, maintain the demand that and point your weapons at somebody who's acting poorly, that they could really just shift focus and support the Saudis. After all, or the Iranians. After all, the Iranians oppose the terrorist groups AQAP. Al-Nusra, ISIS in Syria and Iraq and things like that, whereas Saudi Arabia has supported these groups. And so actually Iran would maybe make for a more natural ally. So Saudi Arabia had that dread. Also, at that time, the deputy crown prince and prime minister was, I think, 29 years old. That's Mohammed bin Salman, who's now the full-on crown prince and often considered the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. And basically, he saw an opportunity to be a young hotshot, come in and label the Houthis as an Iranian-backed group. They don't have an air force, and so he thought he would go in with his air force and his special operations troops that were trained by the U.S. and wipe out the Houthis, and it just absolutely didn't happen. They named the operation Decisive Storm, and here we are 7 years later with if anything, the Houthis have made gains. I guess if you look since maybe December, then the UAE Bat Giants Brigade has made some gains in the Mareb and Shabwa provinces. But generally speaking, the past 7 years, the gains have been made by the Houthis, or the territory has remained pretty status quo. And and so the reason for the U.S. Getting involved in this war was to help Mohammed bin Salman's profile and placate the Saudis over the Iran deal, so they won't continue to throw a fit about that. And this is all very important in what is the real context that people should know about the Yemen war. I think that's, kind of what I wanted to mention on my article. I do have a couple news stories here on Yemen. The White House is continuing to look at adding the Houthis to the foreign terrorist organizations list, which would make it criminal to do any kind of business with the Houthis, and it'll make it a lot harder to bring aid into that country. The very nefarious Brett McGurk is one of the main people pushing this. Also worth noting that the State Department labeled the Houthis' most recent attack on Saudi Arabia as a terrorist attack. Of course, the U.S. never even often mentions or condemns when Saudi Arabia, say, drops a U.S.-made bomb on a migrant detention facility and kills 91 people, but yet, that when the Houthis fire a missile into Saudi Arabia and no one is killed or one person is killed or something like that, then that's a terrorist attack. And so that label does seem to indicate to me that even if they don't move forward with adding the Houthis to that list this time, that they're going to be doing it in the future, and they're just building the need, building closer to it. Saudi Arabia again attacked a telecommunications ministry building in Yemen, this time in the capital city of Sana'a. From my understanding in some recent communications I have, I believe there is still internet in Yemen, and there's no reason to think that they knocked out the internet with this most recent attack. The Houthis are blaming the escalation in Yemen on the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and so that's pretty interesting that and something that comes up from reporting on the ground in Yemen, where they call this the American war. This isn't Saudi Arabia's war, it's the American war. And that was the other really critical point that Dave Smith made on Rogan. And then this, I think the last story I have on Yemen was 5 UN staff members were abducted in southern Yemen. This is in the capital city of Aden, that is controlled by Saudi Arabia, where, you had UN staff members that were just snatched up. I tried to do some digging. I couldn't really find who was claimed to be behind this attack yet, if it was motivated by ideology or monetary incentives or something like that. But it does, I think, go to show the situation in Yemen pretty clearly, and why people are moving to Houthi-held territory, because, again, even UN aid workers are being snatched up, on the ground in southern Yemen. All right, now I want to move on and talk about my article here on Mali, and I titled it "The End of a Forever War," and that is because Mali is known as France's Forever War. And so yesterday we had an announcement by French President Emmanuel Macron that Operation Barkhane will begin to wind down after 9 years, and it will take about 6 months for the European soldiers to withdraw from Mali. This is a war that was set off by the wreckage of Libya, as Danny Sherjan explains, and I quote him here in this article, saying, "In fact, toppling Muammar Gaddafi may count as a single event by funneling fighters, firearms, and grievances into the Sahel's current conflict zones in the U.S. Western-induced tsunami of blowback." And so, that's what Danny is saying here, that you get this all over the Sahel region. And that's why, on the show, we talk about Burkina Faso and Nigeria and Niger and Mali and Chad, where you have an increased terrorism presence, and this has caused various problems. Part of the reason why the president in Burkina Faso was recently removed in a military coup was in part because, the military felt like he wasn't doing enough. And, while that could just be a pretext from the military to take power, it certainly is true that there is a growing jihadist presence in these areas. And, just if you look up what they say or what happens in these areas in the Western press, they're very short articles, but it's men on motorbikes came to a village, set everything on fire and killed 20 people, 30 people, 50 people, 100 people, 150 people. Just so many dying in these mass slaughter events in, again, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And of course, that's part of where we get where we are. Now, the reason that France is exiting Mali is not because they are having any success. In fact, it is the opposite. I write, the decision comes after months of increasing tensions with the ruling military leadership headed by Colonel Assimi Goïta. The colonel most recently seized power in his second coup last May. While he is currently at odds with the West, he was backed by France and the U.S. after his first successful coup in 2020. He has also participated in AFRICOM training programs. So yet another coup waged by somebody who was trained by AFRICOM. The number is, I think, getting close to 10 at this point. While his deep state ties to the Pentagon were highlighted by the Washington Post soon after the 2020 putsch, saying he worked for years with U.S. Special Operations Forces focused on fighting extremism in West Africa. He spoke regularly with U.S. troops and attended U.S.-led training exercises, said officers from both countries who spoke on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter. The relationship with Goïta seems to have deteriorated over accusations that Mali was employing mercenaries from Russia's Wagner Group. Both Moscow and Bamako denied the allegations, but have acknowledged that the Russian military now has a presence in Mali. Talked about this in the past on the show. I'm not sure if the Wagner Group guys are in Mali or not, but it should be, it's not great that they're there, but at the same time, there's plenty of Western forces still in Mali, because again, this withdrawal is going to take 6 months, but there are definitely Russian forces there, and that is, I think, part of the shift of what's happening in Mali. Tensions heightened after he said it would take 5 years to transition back to civilian rule. In a response, Paris backed the Economic Community of West African States, a 15-nation group that Mali is a member of, in placing heavy sanctions on Mali. The government reports the sanctions have already caused economic suffering. The government claims that it missed payments on bonds because of the sanctions. The ruling military junta then began loudly demanding that Western forces leave the country. In January, it succeeded in getting Denmark to remove its 300 soldiers and expelled the French ambassador soon after. While no direct military broke out between the Malian government and Western forces, the Malian leader accused Macron of creating a de facto partition in his country. Western forces did continue to come under fire from jihadist factions. On January 23rd, a French soldier was killed and an American wounded in an attack on a French base in the Malian city Gao. Thursday Thursday's announcement from Macron signals an end to the ground war in Mali, meaning American and Western troops are now likely to be out of harm's way. However, Macron did not declare an end to the border war, a broader war, and thousands of troops will remain in the region. So, they are transferring the troops out of Mali. I think France had at the peak about 5,100 troops there. No idea how many American troops are there. There's also some, I think, Latvian or Estonian troops, I forget which one, and then from a couple other European countries. And so they're going to move to, Burkina Faso or Niger or something like that. The U.S. has large drone bases in the region, definitely in Niger and definitely in Cameroon. So one other thing I did want to mention is that the U.S., I write, initially upon entering office, Biden sought to scale back America's military involvement in Mali. However, as a part of Biden's pivot to Asia, he entered into an arms agreement with the UK and Australia, dubbed AUKUS. The agreement gave Australia access to American nuclear-powered submarines, leading Canberra to cancel its multi-billion-dollar order for diesel-powered submarines from France. Macron's government became irate with the U.S. and in an effort to repair the relationship, Biden agreed to increase American support for Operation Barkhane. It is unclear how Paris's decision will impact the American military footprint in the Sahel. The lion's share of U.S. support for France came in the form of air support with aerial drones, and America still has several large drone bases in countries bordering Mali. It is unlikely then that Washington meddling in Mali isn't over. So, yep, I do think that, the war in Mali is not over, although it will definitely change, maybe resembling Afghanistan some, especially with the major sanctions that were recently announced on Mali, that it's going to shift to maybe more of an economic war, and trying to, my guess would be the goal is to have the Malian government push the Russians out and invite the West back in. Not sure if that's going to happen, but I am pretty sure that the Malian people are going to continue to suffer unnecessarily under the West military footprint. I will note that today that the military junta in Mali did say that they expect the French and the European soldiers to leave immediately and not, take 6 months to do so, because, of course, they say they're going to do it in 6 months, and 3 years from now they're still there. So they're saying you need to leave now. Again, no indication yet that there's any tensions or potential for direct clashes between the two sides, which of course could become problematic pretty quickly since there are Russian soldiers backing the Malian government now. But I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to listen, or that they're not going to try to really find some way to push on that government. And that could come in the sense of war, although my guess is it's going to be more economic warfare. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Please continue to share, support, subscribe, donate if you can. All the information is in the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute. I do want to take just a minute to say that I put out, I think, 5 shows this week. I probably can't keep up that pace, and the typical schedule is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, although I typically record shows the day before to release that morning, so sometimes they come out Sunday, Tuesday, or Thursday night. But anyways, lately there's been so much going on that I'm putting out a ton of bonus content. I've also been doing a lot of writing at the Institute. A lot of it gets republished at antiwar.com, so continue to check out antiwar.com for my work, but also, of course, everything's up at the Institute. And then let's see, anything else I was going to... No, I think that's it. Thanks, everybody. The Yemen article has gotten a great response, hundreds of likes on Twitter, and I just really appreciate everybody doing that, and I'll continue to keep on writing and recording these shows. Thanks, everybody.